One of the reasons that we decided to do a form of responsive reading this morning is because these Psalms that we're looking at this week, next week, are a group or a part of a collection of Psalms known as the Songs of Ascent. And so these are songs that the people of Israel would have recited, sang as they journeyed to Jerusalem. So if you think of ancient Israel, you have people living in different towns, villages during the time and in the cities. And 3 times a year, they would travel to the highest point of Israel, known as the capital city of Jerusalem, also called the city on a hill. It was the place where God's Spirit would come and actually touch the earth in the temple. That's the epicenter of God's redeeming work within the world was taking place in Jerusalem. And so as they would journey as pilgrims towards Jerusalem 3 times a year, once in the spring for Passover, in the early summer they would be headed there for the Feast of Pentecost, and then in the fall they would be going there for the Feast of the Tabernacles. And on their way there, they would recite or sing these psalms that we now have recorded in our scriptures from Psalm 120 to 134. And they were called the Song of Ascent as they were ascending the mountain, the hill of the Lord. And so this journey from 120 to 134 is about their chasing after God. Eugene Peterson wrote a book called A Long Obedience in the Same Direction, in which it is a journey in which he describes Psalm 120 to 134 as our discipleship, our apprenticing, our becoming like Jesus, our journey of becoming like Him through these Psalms. So it describes our life of chasing after Him. So if you read these Psalms, you'll notice where there's Psalms of joy. There are Psalms of difficulty. There are Psalms of fear. All of this because it's describing our journey of following after Jesus. It very much mirrors our chasing after Jesus. And so when we get to Psalm 130, in the midst of these Songs of Ascent, what we see is a psalm that is all about sorrow and suffering and what we are to do in the midst of that suffering. And so one of the reasons we wanted to read this aloud is because we get the feel of what it would have been like to hear voices singing or reciting these psalms as they journeyed on their journey with Jesus. And so this morning, getting you to hear those words read out loud, but then you responding is a part of that experience. Now, as we walk through this passage, I will read this passage again as we take out different sections and look at what we understand about suffering, but then also our journey in it. And so this morning, we're going to start by reading the first 2 verses together. If your Bible's divided up in little sections, that's the way we'll be looking at it this morning. So verses 1 and 2 of Psalm 130, just to hear it again, it says, "Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord. O Lord, hear my voice, and let your ears be attentive to the voice of my pleas for mercy." So the psalm opens here with someone who is in anguish. We see this because of the language that's used here. Someone that is described as being in their depths, someone that's in need of mercy. So we don't know what particular thing has happened for this pilgrim to respond this way or why they are in the situation that they're in. All we are getting here is what they're saying to God in the midst of the difficulty that they find themselves in. So there is this truth that we pull out from Psalm 130 that underlines everything else that's about to be said, and that is the truth that suffering is a normal part of our human condition. Suffering is a normal part of human life. Eugene Peterson, in reflecting upon this passage in his book, A Long Obedience in the Same Direction, says this. He says, quote, "Suffering is a part of what it means to be human. That we can no more not suffer in our lives than an oak tree cannot lose its leaves in the fall." Going through life means that you and I are going to go through suffering just like the oak tree is going to go through losing its leaves. It is a very natural existence within what it means to be a human. Verses 1 and 2 is a reminder of that. Notice that it doesn't shy away from it. It acknowledges the fact this is a reality. Now, we do not like to acknowledge that suffering is a normal part of life. There are infamous stories of people coming here to America from other cultures and marveling at the fact that we will do everything we can to avoid any type of suffering that we experience in our lives. And the reason is because we have been told that life is about the pursuit of happiness. So if anything gets in the way, and suffering obviously would get in the way of our pursuit of happiness, then we will do anything we can to get rid of it so we don't have to face up to it. So whether that is simply ignoring it and acting like it doesn't exist, or numbing our sense of suffering that would come through like drinking of something, or through the purchasing of more things to kind of give us an idea or the facade that things are okay so we don't have to sit in our suffering, or we will explain away our suffering to keep us from facing up to the reality of it. We'll try to make sense of the suffering that's going on, because then we don't have to actually just sit in the fact that we are suffering. We can just come up with all of these reasons as to why these things are taking place. And then bypassing the fact that we need to be, or that being in suffering is a part of our existence as humans. And if it is a part of our normal existence, that means that we can't avoid it, that we can't ignore it, we can't numb it, we can't seek to explain it away. What this passage is telling us is that we must acknowledge our suffering to the Lord. We must acknowledge it. Now, this is super simple, but typically the way this manifests itself in conversations with people who are going through suffering is they will say things like, it's a hard time. Well, yes, it is, but a lot of times that's the only way we want to describe it, because we really don't want to sit in the midst of our suffering. But if you notice here, this psalmist doesn't give us the exact reasons as to why they're sitting in suffering, but he says this phrase, or she says this phrase here, and says, let your ears be attentive. Meaning, listen to every detail that I'm going to tell you. Everything that I'm about to speak to you, Lord, I want you to hear them. The things that make logical sense and the things that don't make logical sense. I'm going to tell you all the things that I know and all the things that I fear. I'm going to tell you everything. And I need you to listen, Lord, to everything that I am going to say. This pilgrim is speaking to the Lord as you would when a friend would come to you in crisis. When you are in a moment of crisis or a moment of suffering and a friend comes to you, you're not worried about, let me help them understand what I'm sitting in. And let me explain everything from A to Z so they can understand what's going on. No, you are saying logical things. You're saying illogical things. You're saying what you feel. You're saying what may be true, what you don't know to be true, what you may be fearing in this moment. You're telling them everything. Why? Because you know in that moment that friend is with you to listen. They have no other role. You are fully aware that they can't do anything to fix your situation. So what do you want them to be? Just be. Just be with me. And when I say ridiculous things, I don't need you to correct me. I just need you to hear. And this pilgrim looks at the Lord and says, would you be attentive? Every word that I say, everything that makes sense and doesn't make sense. Father, would you hear it? And so this pilgrim then moves on. So we have this understanding suffering is a normal part of being human. Then we move into verses 3 and 4. If you, O Lord, should mark iniquities, O Lord, who could stand? But with you there is forgiveness, that you may be feared. So there's an acknowledgement within these two verses here that God has the ability to help. He has the ability to help. The pilgrim is going, my sin has given me no legs to stand on. There is no hope that I have within my own power to deliver any type of deliverance from the suffering or any hope that I may have. But then he says, but with you, there is forgiveness. But with you, there is forgiveness. He's going, I am in this place of suffering, Lord, and there's nothing that I can do to rescue myself from the midst of it. But you can. This is what we call standing on the character of God. Standing on the character of God. It is knowing something to be true about our God and calling him to it. Not because it's a challenge, but because it's an expression of extreme confidence that we have in him. So much like if you were on a basketball team and your team has to make a 3-point shot at the last second to win the game, and you have Steph Curry on your team, there is no doubt who the ball is going to. It is going to Steph Curry. Why? Because you're going to go like, well, let's see if you can make it. No, you know he's going to make it. So you're giving him the ball. In the same way, it's an expression of confidence in God to call him to his character and say, this is what I know to be true about you. And so because I know this to be true about you, this is what I'm going to do in this moment. I will stand on who you are. He picks back up on this in verses 7, 8 that we'll get to in a moment. But when he stands on this confidence right here, he's calling God to his character. What is interesting is he puts two words side by side that I naturally would not put side by side. In verse 4, he puts the word, there's forgiveness that you may be feared. Forgiveness and fear. Those are two words that I typically wouldn't put together in the same sentence or parallel with one another. Because if I'm forgiven, what do I need to be fearful of? That's my first thought. But that's a complete misunderstanding of the word fear here. Fear is not frightened, but a respectful awe. So the pilgrim is stating the fact that you, Father, have the ability to pull me out of this suffering, and only you have the ability to do it. So this leads me to a place of respectful awe of who you are. This pilgrim possibly is going, I've tried everything. I can't get out of this situation. But you have the ability. And that understanding leads me to a deep place of awe. And so here I am in wonder of who you are and the greatness of who you are. And I'm telling you everything that is on my heart in the midst of this suffering, knowing that this is something that I'm going through. And then based on who God is, then he moves into the next part of the psalm where he talks about what the pilgrim is to do in the midst of suffering. Now remember, this is 120 through 134 is all about our journeying with God. And so this pilgrim is going, when I find myself in a place of suffering, what am I supposed to do? This is where he turns in the next part of this psalm in verses 5 and 6. It says, I wait for the Lord. My soul waits. And in his word I hope. My soul waits for the Lord, more than watchmen for the morning, more than watchmen for the morning. So in the midst of our suffering, it is very normal. What we do is we wait and we watch. Now, every single type A person in this room is very upset with that. And everybody else in the room is going, no. When I'm in a season of suffering, I want steps 1, 2, and 3. But what we see here in Scripture is that in the midst of our suffering, we are to wait and watch. Now that seems utterly insane to us. But let us not forget that in the midst of our suffering, there is nothing that we can do to rescue ourselves. There's nothing that we can do to rescue ourselves. We have acknowledged that God is the only one who has the ability to rescue us from the season of suffering that we find ourselves in. So what is the Christian to do? Wait and watch. A pilgrim uses this imagery of a watchman. So if you think of ancient cities, they would have been surrounded with a wall that was used for protection. And there would have been watchmen that would have been placed on this wall at night to watch and to see what's going on, to pay attention, to watch the horizon. And if someone came to the gates that needed in, they were the ones that are going to be discerning on, like, let them in, keep them out, those kind of things. This is a job that they had. But every watchman that stood on that wall knew full well that there were things outside of his control. He knew full well that the only hope he had was the rising of the sun. That the darkness was going to limit his ability to see into what was really taking place. And so his only hope was this confidence that he had in the coming sunrise, knowing that there was nothing that he could do to turn the earth to make the sun rise. There was nothing that he could do to make the sun shine. He knew all of those things were outside of his control. So what he would do is he would wait for the sign of those foundational things to take place. He would wait for things to get lighter, to go from black to gray as the sun began to rise. He would look for the peaking of light over the distant horizon. In our current times, our current mind, it's not something that we see every day, but so it's helpful to think about it like this. Think about when you're in a waiting room on a loved one who is in surgery. You know that there's absolutely nothing that you can do in that moment. You are not the doctor. You are not the nurses in charge of what's taking place in the surgery room. And you have entrusted your confidence over to the ones that have the ability, the power, and the knowledge to be able to affect change in that loved one who is in that surgery room. And all you are left doing is waiting and watching. And you are in that waiting room and you are looking for the first sign of the nurse that is coming to the door. You're looking as she opens the door, where is she walking? Is her body headed towards you or is she headed to someone else in that room? And as you notice that she's headed to you, you're noticing her posture, the gestures that are on her face. What is she doing with her hands? Or how are they beginning to speak with you? What tone are they going to have? Why? Because you are expecting news. You are waiting and you are watching in that moment. In our suffering, in our seasons of suffering that we find ourselves in, what we are doing is we're looking to the one that has the ability to affect change, and we are knowing that he is going to move. So we are waiting and we are watching. So we talked about this confidence we see this in verse 3 and 4. Where he has this respectful awe of God. Now we move into where he comes back to this theme and he talks about the confidence that we are to have in God. Look in verses 7 and 8. O Israel. So just imagine, again, pilgrims journeying on together. People are saying this out loud. You're hearing your neighbors speak this over you. O Israel, hope in the Lord. For with the Lord there is steadfast love, and with him is plentiful redemption. And he will redeem Israel from all his iniquities. Listen to the confidence. Think about journeying with people. If you're in a crowd of people, there are people who can barely utter these words because they're in a season of suffering where they're going, I know this is true, but I don't know how I can say it out loud right now. Standing next to someone who just came through a season of suffering, who is shouting this at the top of their lungs. You have someone else that's completely ignorant to what's going on. Their life is blissful right now. And so they have no idea that people around there have walked through seasons of suffering. And so they're saying this in the joy of the heart, not knowing that right around the corner of their life, tragedy is going to strike. And this will be the words that bring them through it. But they say words like, there is steadfast love. He is plentiful redemption. He will redeem from all iniquities. In the heart of our God is his desire to rescue. They have confidence in that because of who he is. Our God is moved by brokenness. Our cries of suffering are heard by a God whose heart's desire is to rescue. So we can wait and watch in the midst of our suffering because we know that redemption always gets the final say. Suffering never is the final word. Redemption always gets the final say. Thinking of the Old Testament, the story of Joseph, sold into slavery, but redemption got the final say. Moving into the book of Ruth, Naomi, she loses her husband and her sons. Deep loss, but redemption gets the final say. Moving into the New Testament, Jesus is caught in a situation in which people bring a woman to him to be stoned because of adultery. Deep suffering, public scorn, but redemption got the final say. Or think of the cross. Deep suffering. The weight of the world's sin poured out on the sinless Son of God, yet there is redemption. You and I can wait in our suffering, and we can watch in our suffering because redemption will get the final say. So I don't know, just like in the journey of the group to Jerusalem and their pilgrimage on to Jerusalem, I don't know if there's some of us in this room that you are walking through your own personal suffering. I don't know if there's some of us in the room that aren't walking through a season of suffering. If you walk through a very recent time of suffering. But I do know as a collective body of believers that at this time, this is a time of suffering for Getwell Church Hernando. But redemption will get the final say. That the heart of our God, the foundation that we cannot change, thanks be to God, is that He has a heart of rescue and redemption for His people. This is the foundational truth. And so our response to His heart is to watch and to wait. Now, for those of us that are still struggling with this idea that, Nate, what you're telling me to do is that I'm just not supposed to do anything? I'm just supposed to sit here. No. Waiting and watching is not doing nothing. I mean, if you're a hunter in the room, when you sit in a deer stand or you sit in a duck blind or wherever you are, you're waiting and watching. You're not doing nothing. You're paying attention to everything. The direction of the wind. You're paying attention to the snaps of leaves and twigs around you to alert you to what may be coming your way. You're not doing nothing. You're waiting and you're watching. Or if you go to a theater and you enjoy plays, when you go to a theater, you don't sit and do nothing. No, you're waiting and watching. I mean, think about watching a movie. You may have seen a movie 1,000 times, but yet you watch it as if you're waiting for something that you didn't know was going to happen. You're waiting and you're watching. In the same way, when we find ourselves in seasons of suffering, collectively as a body, individually, it doesn't matter. When we find ourselves in that season, we are to wait and watch and to see what the Lord is doing in the midst of it, knowing that His heart is for redemption. He is going to move. He is not going to let suffering get the final say. If we ever doubt that, look to the cross. Death did not get the final say. Suffering in that instance did not get the final say. It does not get the final say. So what we are to do is to look, wait, watch, see what He's doing. What is God doing in the midst of our season of suffering that shows us His heart? Things that I've been able to see over the last week. Gathering with a group of teenagers who are walking through a difficult time in a room and learning how to write a psalm on their own, using their own words, and then finding a group of high school girls gathered around praying together. What is that? That is the heart of the Lord for redemption in the midst of suffering. Or hearing stories of the way this church is being the church, reaching out to people who are hurting and suffering. Even in the midst of the suffering, going, no, I know that redemption gets the final say and suffering does not. So in the midst of our suffering, personal, collectively, what we are doing is we're trusting in the heart of our God to rescue, knowing that none of those things that we've seen take place in the last week had anything to do with any of the leaders that are in those spaces. It is only by the move of God that those things are happening. It is the light shining in the midst of the darkness. And church, there is nothing that is going to stop God's heart for redemption. There is no power. There is no darkness. There is no demonic force. There is no sin. There is not even death itself that will stop the heart of the rescue of God. So while we wait and we watch for our rescue, we trust in a God who is full of steadfast love and is full of plentiful redemption.